So I imagine others will watch this on video because there were apparently a lot signed up for this session.
Right.
But obviously we haven't a lot dialed in. But yeah, so this is about boards and governance. So I'm going to go through 4 parts. So, what do we mean by governance? Why do we need it? When should we implement good governance? And then how do we actually do it? And like normal, just interrupt any time. Athel, keen to hear, like, what are you sort of interested in hearing from this session?
I guess it feels like a bit of a complex space, and it feels like there's many factors that are around governance. Is governance of what your processes at work, or is it governance of your director, your board? Or I think it'd be great to hear a bit more about that, and the difference between director governance versus advisory board governance. Yeah, it'd be great. That's sort of the questions on my head.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about those points as we go through the content. So we'll just start by what we mean by governance. And I know that I've put boards into the definition of today, like boards and governance, but really we're talking about governance beyond just simply boards and boards of directors. So when we talk about governance, we mean all of the systems by which we can direct and control the organisation. So by that, we mean the structure of the organisation, the processes, decision-making, accountability, control, and behaviour of the entity. So it's much more than just a board. Often we think governance, I'll put a board in and now I've got governance, as if almost that connotation of government. But really there's a lot more to it. So really when you think about governance, think about holistically, how do we direct and control this organisation? And when we start, like Athel, you'd be familiar with this, when you start as a single founder, obviously you've got total control, or at least you have a perception of total control. But the thing is, there's actually a lot of variables we can't control. And I'll go through these in a moment. But there's a lot of things like our customers, suppliers, competitors that, ultimately we need systems and processes around to create control there. So just when we think about governance, just think very broadly. How do we direct and control the organisation as a whole? So why do we need to worry about this? Well, number one is the legal responsibility. So if you have a Pty Ltd company in Australia, for example, so a proprietary limited company, by virtue of being a director of that company, you have legal responsibilities. And some of those responsibilities carry with it jail terms if you get it wrong. So even if you are, an executive inside a company, you're not protected by virtue of being an employee. You can also go to jail potentially or face fines for certain behavior, but particularly board members. So if you own a company and you're a director of that company, you do have these legal responsibilities that you need to be aware of. But outside of just the criminal law aspect, there's also civil law. So we need to protect ourselves against being sued. And that includes being sued by potentially employees, by suppliers, by customers, by competitors. And so having this awareness and a good, healthy governance practice and systems helps prevent that legal risk. The other thing is it's not just, about the board and the directors, but we need to protect against employee fraud. So this is, I looked this morning just for, a most recent article I could find. And the thing is employee fraud is huge. So, I used to have a cafe and we caught a couple of staff at different points over the 3 years taking cash out of the till, for example. But this example here is much more sophisticated. This particular person, the employee of this travel insurance agency, actually defrauded the company of $758,000. So I've heard cases of up to $1 billion being defrauded from companies by employees.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a huge issue. And again, you need good governance to be able to detect, prevent, and discourage this type of behavior. But same with suppliers. So in this case, again, just a recent one from April this year, a New South Wales bookkeeper was charged after defrauding some of her clients, like one business of 1.5 million. And some of the work I used to previously do in law enforcement, this was a really big issue with accountants actually defrauding their clients. Because as you know, as a small business owner, you hand over all your financials to your accountant and you trust in what they do. And they tell you you've got this tax bill and you pay the funds and whatever else. But there's been cases where those tax bills are actually made up and it's just you're paying it to the accountant and they just keep that cash. So again, how do we have systems and good governance to detect and prevent these types of fraudulent incidents? And then it's not just those that are close to us, well, as in employed or that we pay for their services, it's also customer fraud. So this example is a recent one from about a year ago where there was this scam where people would go into a cafe, order a coffee, pay on FPOS, and then sort of confuse the staff member into saying that they've been overcharged and then taking control of the FPOS device to issue a massive refund, like a $10,000 refund back onto their credit card. So they just were basically stealing money from the small business owners. So your customers can defraud you. They can send through false refund requests, falsify payment receipts, all sorts of things. And then also there's competitors. So your competitors can actually conduct espionage. And this is a recent case, again, just April this year, so just a couple of weeks ago, where a PhD chemist was hired by competitors to go inside Coca-Cola to steal their recipes and their processes for manufacturing Coke. And you know what that IP of that secret source and secret ingredient list is worth to Coca-Cola. And the thing is, all of these are, the reason I've chosen things that were just in the press today are because they're everyday occurrences. And we need to actually be aware of these things. And if we make the mistake of thinking they won't happen to us, then we'll inevitably fall victim to them. Like the stats, it's actually quite alarming. So for all those like negative connotation reasons, we need to have good governance. But there's also lots of positive reasons. And that is that, the statistics show that companies that have good governance actually end up growing faster. And that's because of a lot of reasons, not just the fact that they're not having these fraudulent things happen that hold them back, but also the practice of good governance also leads to better thinking, better clarity, better decision-making, better operational activity. So the companies tend to grow faster. But also, when it comes time to seek investment or to be acquired, investors and companies acquiring you will look at your governance practices. And one of the things that actually delays most investment deals the most, like the thing that actually slows down the investment process the most, is during due diligence when the investor is looking under the hood of your business and realizes that you actually don't have most of the documentation you need. You don't have documented procedures. All the things that you thought you own the IP of, you actually don't own, or you don't have documented proof that you own. You don't have your staff employment contracts. So it really holds back the investment process. But also in a lot of cases, the deal falls over at that point because the investor isn't satisfied that you have good corporate governance. And therefore, they don't want to take that risk because with poor corporate governance, as we've just seen, you run greater risks of fraud. You also run greater legal risk, legal liability risk. And you also run the risk of not operating at the performance level that you should be operating at. So it's a big red flag for an investor to not invest if you don't have good governance in place, and that you can prove a history of good governance, not just at the point in time at which they're investing. And similarly, for someone who's acquiring the company, they don't want to own something that has a potential huge lawsuit sitting under it, or that doesn't have good governance. So again, that's another positive reason why you should nail your governance, because it will just make the investment process faster, make acquisition more likely, and it'll make you grow faster. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, yep.
So then the next question is, if we know what governance is, it's any systems and processes that can control and direct the company. We know why we should be doing it, both from the negative and the positive. The question then becomes, well, when do we put these things in place? And I know most of the time when we talk about starting a new venture, the entire focus is on get a customer, like go validate in the market, get a customer, get some initial traction, prove demand, and then worry about the rest later. But the thing about governance is you need to put things in place right at the start, even when it's just you. And part of the reason for that is, again, to protect yourself. Again, it's to prevent fraud. It's to prevent the legal risk. It's to maximize your chances of success. But also, as you start growing, to do it retrospectively is just that little bit harder. So it's a good practice to get in from day one, to start always be implementing good governance. That doesn't mean you have to rush out now and put all of these things in place. So what I'm going to share are, over a dozen different things that you can do. And I'm not saying you have to go do every single one today, but you should definitely have them on your roadmap, and you should start performing, like behaving with good government practices right now. So I'll go through what I mean by that. But the point is, don't make the mistake of delaying this, thinking, oh, I only need good governance when we're a significant company, or when we reach a certain size, or when we have staff, or when we have a board of directors. No, you need to have good governance from the start. So now we're going to look at how do you do that? And I've just got someone else joining the room, so I'm just going to add them in. Welcome, PJ. We just kicked off about 10 minutes ago. We've just gone through what good governance is, why we should have good governance from the negative side and the positive side, the fact that we should implement good governance practices from day one and not wait until some mythical time in the future where we're a real business, for example. And now you've joined just at the time where we're going to go through the details of the mechanics of how do we put into place good governance practices. And all of this has been recorded, so if you have missed any of the start, you can jump onto the recording that will be shared afterwards as well. But now moving into how do we put into place good governance practices. And I'm going to touch those when I described governance at the start being, systems, processes, structures, behaviors. I'm going to touch on each category of those in terms of good governance mechanisms. So starting with having professional advisors around you. So this is something you can do from day one, depending where you are in the life cycle of your venture, or if you're inside an existing organization. But part of good governance is having good professional service providers around you and involved in your business. So by that, we mean having a bookkeeper, having an accountant. Now, even if you might handle the bookkeeping, to start with, and that's great early in your venture. But even just employing someone who is a bookkeeper to look over your data entry before handing your accounts over to your accountant to do the end of year tax return, for example, is a really good practice. So for myself, with one of our current businesses, it's very low volume. It's mostly consulting for a couple of us, very low transaction volume. I do the bookkeeping myself, but I have a bookkeeper that I pay each quarter just to log in and check all the data entry and just to see what's missed. And she's awesome. She often picks up on things that I hadn't thought of. And then at that point, I hand it over to my accountant, who does the more strategic analysis and the tax analysis, and does the tax advisory piece. And then basically then we lodge everything. I'm a huge fan also of having, at some point having a CFO. Now, you can have a virtual CFO, but this is more that strategic advisory type role. And also playing a bit into not just tax advisory, but more into strategic financial advisory. So how are we looking at funding? How are we managing our cash flow? Are there strategies around, particularly if you're starting to go international, how should we be looking at transferring funds into different currencies? Or even nowadays, if you look at what Tesla did with crypto, like how do you park potentially funds that you might have under management into different asset classes? All those sort of things are more the role of someone like a CFO typically than the typical accountant, but that's not always true. Sometimes you find a genius accountant. And then two others I have here is a lawyer. So I highly recommend having a trusted lawyer that knows your space and field quite well. You don't need to have them on retainer. I definitely encourage you to build a good relationship with them, but just someone that you can bounce the odd question off, but also can help you with the structure and entity. So getting your structure right from day one. I don't want to go into structures in this session, but part of good governance is having good structures around where your IP sits, where your trading business sits, partly so that you can claim things like the R&D tax credits if you're eligible for those, but making sure as well that your lawyer understands the space that you're in, and the different grants and everything that are available will also help. And the other one on there that you might not have expected is an auditor, and I'll talk a bit later about why and when you should engage an auditor. But it's not just a financial auditor. So often when we think of audit, we think of tax compliance audit. What I mean here by an auditor is more like a forensic auditor. So someone who actually looks at all of your policies and procedures within your company and actually goes back and looks and tells you whether your staff, your executives, whether your board have all been compliant with your own internal policies and procedures. And I'll talk more about why that's necessary. But the thing is here, you can have this arsenal of team around you who you just pay for their time when you need them, or perhaps you have them on retainer. Important point here is to find people who understand your industry. So it's much better if they understand the vertical that you're operating in. So Athol, for you, like if they understand health, the health sector, particularly if they understand hospitals, public service type environment, that would be very beneficial too. But then you also want your professional advisors to be people who understand the growth journey that you're on. And what I mean by that is if you're aiming to build a high growth company for exit and acquisition, and you plan on raising investment funding from angel investors, from venture capital funds, maybe from private equity, you really need professionals who understand that. Because an accountant who deals in typically small businesses, for example, like a corner fish and chip shop or a real estate agency, typically won't understand the nuances of a term sheet from an investor. And that can slow things down. It also means you won't get the best advice. So I highly recommend you find professionals who've previously worked with businesses that are on the same trajectory that you are. And that includes if you plan on going overseas, it's great if you can find an advisor who has previously taken companies overseas into those specific markets. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to find this magical unicorn accountant that knows all of those things. You might find that you have to engage when it does come time to maybe set up a Delaware company in the US to enter the US market. You might have to find another accountant to do that part of the process for you. But ideally, just the point I'm trying to make here is find someone with industry knowledge in your vertical and find someone who's advised companies that are on a similar growth path to you so they can identify those pitfalls. Now, the other part of this is you can't outsource responsibility. And what I mean by that is don't ever make the mistake of, for example, getting your accountant to do all your tax returns and then it all comes back to you and you just sign it. You don't understand it. And in your mind, it's like, well, my accountant's got this sorted. I don't need to worry about it. I just sign, it's done. The thing is, if like I was saying before, as to why do we need governance? And I gave that example of the book of the accountant who defrauded one of her clients 1.5 million. Number one, if you're not across everything that's, your advisors are advising you, and that's ultimately what they're doing, then the risk of, poor governance manifesting as fraud is much higher. But also, from a legal perspective, you can't delegate your responsibility. So if you're a director of a company and the ATO comes to you with, a criminal charge of tax avoidance or whatever, you can't have a defense of, well, I just did whatever my accountant said. Ultimately, the responsibility does stop with you. There are exceptions to that in different cases, but the reality is you can't outsource responsibility. And it's also just not good practice to outsource responsibility for running your company. So even though you find these professional advisors, remember they are advising you. And therefore you have to take that advice on. You still have to be responsible for decision-making. The other part that'll help with that is your own personal professional development. I'm including this in good governance because I think it's often, I think when we think of governance, we think of what other things can I put in place external to me? And I think it's actually a really healthy mindset to have where you're a key part of good governance in the sense of your own knowledge. So for you to enroll in courses and like the Australian Institute of Company Directors, for example, runs amazing courses on how to be a director of a company. They help you identify your legal risks and responsibilities. But outside of that, your own professional development can include also being part of other CEO groups, for example. So maybe joining, EO, or it could be about, joining other communities where there's other board members and hanging out with other directors. So you get that peer-to-peer learning, but also just any sort of online programs around governance, attending sessions like this, really upskilling yourself. And that includes, what are the latest tax policies affecting corporates? What's the latest R&D? Like, go to an R&D tax session so you understand if your eligibility and everything else. Even though you're getting professional advice, you still need to upskill yourself. And another key part of that is mentors and coaches. So this has come up in obviously a lot of workshops I've run. I'm a huge advocate of building. You think of yourself as a Formula One driver, you want an entire pit crew around you, so that you optimize your own performance, you optimize your company performance, your organization performance. And I include that even if you're someone inside someone else's organization. Like if you're coming into this session as an economic development person inside a council, for example, you should still have this same mentality of how do I find mentors and coaches? So if you are an employee, I encourage you to ask within inside the company or the organization for someone 2 levels above you to mentor you. And the reason we say 2 levels above is because someone who's 1 level above you, it creates this weird principal agent power dynamic where they don't necessarily want you to succeed because of that subservient role and how that plays out for their own progression. But someone 2 levels above you doesn't tend to have, or at least 2 levels above, doesn't tend to have that same dynamic. But also for entrepreneurs, seeking other entrepreneurs who have been through the same experience, that they've grown at the same rate, they're in the same industry, whatever it is, as distinct from a coach who is more someone, they might not have played the game, but they can coach you to how to play the game. But again, this is all about investing in yourself. And you can see where I've started here is bringing this all back to you. Ultimately, if you're the founder, you are responsible for the governance of your company and engineering everything around it. And that starts with engineering yourself. So getting professional advisors around you, getting a good upskilling of your own knowledge, and getting mentors and coaches around you. Then we need to bring in and expand that further. So then how do we add more, expert opinions around us? And this is where we can start looking at an advisory board. Now, an advisory board is distinct from a board of directors. So you'll often hear it said like a board. Typically, when we say just a board of a company, we're referring to the directors. And director actually has a legal definition. Whereas an advisory board is purely just a label that we give to a group of people. It actually has no legal responsibility. They're typically volunteer, although they could be paid. You could choose to pay them for their costs or for their time or on a retainer or give them equity in the business. But an advisory board typically serves the purpose of giving you and potentially the senior management advice on where to take the business and advice on how to enter the market. So it tends to be very strategic around growth of the company or venture. If it's in a different context, though, an advisory board could be advising on regulatory compliance, for example. So you could have an advisory board that maybe it's public servants and lawyers who can advise you. For example, if you're working in the fintech space or you're working in the government space or defense, you might need an advisory board that's specifically on, am I being compliant? You might have a scientific advisory board. You might have a technical advisory board. You might have a sales advisory board. For me, with Startup Catalyst, I had a sponsorship advisory board that were all people inside companies who had influence, who could help me secure sponsorship funding. The beauty of an advisory board is as CEO or founder, you don't have to listen to them. So you don't have to do what they say. You can say, thanks for the advice, I really appreciate it, and do the exact opposite. The other thing about an advisory board is that they don't have a specific legal appointment within the business. So that typically means, depending on how you structure the arrangement and whether you pay them, but it typically means they can just come and go. it also means that they don't have any personal responsibility. So this is where it gets interesting when we start talking about recruiting for boards. So when you're a director, you have legal responsibilities. Under the law, there are certain behaviors and things that you must do, whereas an advisory board doesn't have those obligations. Now, the point of clarity there, and I should say I am not a lawyer. I did study law, but I never actually practice. So everything I'm saying is through the lens of experience of being an entrepreneur. But one thing I have heard is that you need to be careful, because if an advisory board behaves like a board of directors, then the law in a civil case might actually look through that and hold them liable. So they could still be liable. So this is where it's really clear to, for example, one thing I would recommend is you set up an advisory board, just have a simple one-page terms of reference that just says, here's what we expect of you as an advisor, but also say, here's what we don't expect of you. And it's really just to put in writing that this is just an advisory role. There's no legal responsibility that carries with this role. We don't have to listen to your advice, but we appreciate it. And you also stipulate whether it's paid or unpaid. It's just expectation setting. But just by having that one piece of paper can help protect those advisory board members, give them confidence of their potential liability, and also makes it really clear what you expect from them in terms of their time, how often are you going to contact them, all that sort of stuff. So for me with advisory boards, I'm conscious of not using their time. Typically for me, I've always done an advisory board I don't pay them, but I might speak to them once every 2 months. I've done everything where that's a group call where we get everyone on the same call, through to I just might call each one, like I might call one of them a week for a half-hour call, and I might have an advisory board of 6 people, for example. It's really up to you and the stage of where you're at and what you need. The other way of approaching this is to treat the advisory board more like a committee. So if you want a group to work on something, that's a different way of structuring it. I tend to use advisory boards much more sort of one-on-one with the people on the boards. But again, it's totally up to you. The other thing about advisory board is it's a great way to bring potential investors and acquirers into your company. So if you are looking for future investment or to be acquired by someone one day, then bringing that individual on as an advisor onto your advisory board is a really effective way to build a relationship, prove credibility, and then ultimately lead to a potential investment. That's particularly true of seed and angel investors who typically know someone for 6 to 18 months before they invest in them. So the earlier you can build that relationship, the better. As distinct from a board of directors. So board of directors, as I was saying, a director is an actual office holder of a company. They have a title. There's legal obligations attached to that in Australia under ASIC and similar in other jurisdictions around the world. And so when someone comes onto your board and becomes a director, they are basically taking a lot of risk in doing that. So this is why, going back to why should we have good governance, is that a good director, a smart director coming into your company will ask to see minutes of previous meetings. They'll ask to see your documentation. They'll ask to look at your insurance and other things, because as a director, when they step in, they're taking on any liability that the company has and any risk that the company has. Things like if you ever get a commercial lease, sometimes the directors have to go guarantor of some leases, for example. So they're taking that financial risk. There are ways around that through bonds and other things. But it is an important point of distinction. The other thing I'll talk about in a moment is the way that we actually have to listen to our board of directors. So our directors actually have control operationally. And I'll talk about how that power plays out in a moment. There's a whole body of knowledge about being a director and about running boards. And the best source of getting upskilled in that in Australia is the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Their courses aren't cheap, but I highly recommend it. And for those of you that might be listening to this you're more interested in being a board member, I highly recommend joining or signing up for a program with the Australian Institute of Company Directors and then joining as a member. does that all make sense so far before I go into the next little bit? I'm going to talk more about boards, but Athel, does that all make sense?
Yeah, yep. Thanks, Aaron.
So one of the questions that often comes up, from founders that might be working on their own, or it's just a couple of friends that have started a business and they're reluctant to start a board because, I'm going to have a boss. It's like, well, now I'm going to be answerable to others. And will I lose control of my own company? Often comes up as a question. And I just want to explain how so in this example, I'm talking specifically about a specific type of corporate entity here. So there's different models of partnerships, sole traders, business names. What I'm talking about here is specifically around corporate entities. And this can be true of for-profit and not-for-profit. The difference with not-for-profit is instead of shareholders, we talk about members, like typically they're member-based organizations or they're limited by guarantee. I'm not going to worry too much about the legal side of the structures, but this is the point I want to make here is this interplay between shareholders, directors, and management. So like your chief executive, for example. So we all know that shareholders own the company. So shareholders ultimately own the company. So even if you appoint a board of directors, you can't, just by that nature, lose ownership of the company if you hold all the shares, for example. The shareholders then appoint the board. So the shareholders get to vote on the board of directors. Now, sometimes when an investor comes in, they will stipulate that as part of their investment into the company, they get a board seat allocated to them. What that means is they get to choose who their director, they get to choose a director to put on the board. So if we paint that out in a scenario, what I mean by that is even though shareholders vote on who the directors are, you might have an investor who might only own 10% of the company, but they get to appoint, they're guaranteed to be able to appoint one director. So in that case, it's like not all shareholders are equal. They can have different voting rights depending on how you've structured your shareholder agreement. Some shareholder classes can have a multiple of votes on the board of directors, and others, like investors, might have a clause that says we get to allocate one or two directors of our choosing. But ultimately, shareholders choose the board of directors, and then the board of directors are the ones that essentially appoint the management. So they basically appoint a CEO, and then between the CEO and the board is obviously board meetings where there's reports and other things. I make that point because it plays out in a few ways. So going back to the question of can you lose control of your company? Absolutely, you can. What I encourage you to think is if you structure it in the right way and get the right advice, you'll be protected against that. The other thing is, rather than think of it in the sense of the risk, I'd actually think of it in the sense of the gain. And that is by all the reasons why you should bring directors on, which I'm going to talk about in the next little bit. So now looking at who should we bring onto our board of directors, and you could apply this same logic to your advisory board, but I'm just going to go through some categories of the types of people you should think about to bring on your board. So number one, from a risk and governance perspective. So obviously a big part of the board's role is good governance practices and ensuring asset compliance, ensuring all the regulatory compliance and good corporate governance and behavior. So in here, I often like to have someone who's a lawyer or an ex-lawyer and someone who's an accountant, for example. Now, if you've already got them as professional advisors, that might be less necessary. But for me, depending on what you're doing, having a lawyer on your board, they always come from this, both lawyers and accountants in my experience, and I'm being completely stereotypical here, but they often come from a real risk analysis perspective. So they will identify risks in what you're doing, like corporate risks, and they're very good at procedures and processes. So that's one category of people you could consider bringing onto your board. The next is around decision making, and the point here is you want diversity of perspectives. So while if everyone thinks the same, okay, you get a lot of speed from that. But the problem is you have so many blind spots that you'll probably be leaving a lot of potential on the table. So it's really important, like all the data shows board diversity leads to more successful companies. And that's not just diversity of gender, but it's like cultural diversity. And really what I encourage you to think about is diversity of perspectives, diversity of backgrounds and different experiences, because then you're more likely to see blind spots, and you're more likely to have holistic decision-making that'll take you on a different path. Next one is for market access. So what I mean by this is having board members who can open doors and do sales for you. So if you've got some high-profile people who they've got the connections into the industry, and they might even have some of the initial sales meetings for you, or at least prep you on who to talk to, or at least make the connection. So, for you, Athel, with what you're doing, I mean, imagine if you had the health minister on your board. Like that, that's a huge thing, right? That not only would it open doors, but amazing credibility, which is the next one here too, is how do you have credibility? And so many times I see, new businesses start and they've got their board and they've got their advisors, but they're all unknown people, like unknown even in the industry. And so they're still having to prove themselves. Whereas if you can bring someone on that already has credibility in the industry, then that credibility almost instantly transfers. So having people who are the influencers in your industry, or high profile people, like not just an influencer for, you've found someone off Instagram who has 1 million followers. If you're not, I mean, that would make no sense unless you're in that domain. But definitely look at how you bring credibility. The next one is experience. And what I mean by this is experienced entrepreneurs. So I like to have someone on the board who's done it before, like a bit battle hardened. For me now, that probably comes more from personal mentors rather than actually a board position. Next one is for funding. So it's a smart move to bring investors onto your board, not just from the sake of their advice, but from the sake of getting future funding rounds. The closer your investors are to the company and what's going on, the more likely they are to invest in the future, like in future rounds. And the next one here is for exit, which this is something I don't see happen a lot in Australia, but I see it a lot in Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, it's quite common for startup founders to be able to say, I want to be acquired by, I'm going to make up a company. I want to be acquired by PayPal. And so they will have the head of M&A, mergers and acquisitions at PayPal, actually on their board right from the beginning. Because that visibility, when that person sees everything you're doing and just that awareness, they're much more likely to buy your company than someone else's company who's a complete unknown. So thinking about who might acquire me in the future, and then actually getting that specific person in that organization to be on your board is really smart. Now, to wrap all that up, one thing I'll say here is do not be afraid of picking up the phone and asking the most extreme people that you could ask to be on your board. So if any of you are familiar with Steve Jobs, when he was a kid, he rang Hewlett Packard. I think his first, anyway, rang the head of Hewlett Packard and just got mentored by him as a young kid. It's very common, people want to help, and CEOs of companies that might already be established in the market. So for example, someone that might acquire you, they're very keen to give back. And for them, keep in mind that they're stuck in this boring corporate job and they want to live vicariously through your startup. So for them, being on a board of a new startup is actually quite fun. So never dismiss asking someone that you think is out of reach to actually join your board. Understanding that you might first need to bring them on as an advisor and then transition them over to the board of directors as they get to know you. And the last point on this slide is who you'll need on your board will change over time. So don't think of your board as set in stone. Just think of what do you need now and into the next, depending where you're at in your life cycle. If you're still early, who do I need for the next 6 months? If you're a bit more established, you've been around for a few years, who do I need for the next 3 years? And this all depends on your growth rate and where you're heading. Does that all make sense though?
Yeah, lots of some interesting thoughts about some of those key players for sure. Yeah.
Does anyone immediately come to mind for you, Athel, in terms of who you could potentially bring on?
The investor piece, yeah. I've already been speaking to someone that I've thought about asking.
Yeah.
That key industry expert, that's really interesting. Maybe a past health minister, because I know probably a current one may be a bit difficult. But the merger and acquisition, the one where a company you think, no, I probably need to do some thinking about that. Who you think could buy you out in the future? And yeah, I'm not totally sure on that just yet.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's probably one that does come a little bit later as you get clarity on it. One of the risks with that one in particular is that you bring someone in early, and then it turns out that a better fit is their competitor, and that can be a bit hard to retract. It sort of excludes others, so you do need to be conscious of that. The other thing is, for those of you listening to this topic in the context of an well-established company or organization or government department, I've put this through the lens of obviously entrepreneurship and an early stage business venture, but the same logic sort of applies of where are we trying to go and building your board to get you there. So if you look at all of these categories of people, it's all about where will these people add value to take me. So to draw that a bit more concrete, what I mean is there's not a lot of point having a board member who's the expert in where you are right now. You want the board member who's the expert in where you're going or aiming to get to. Because if they're just an expert in where you are right now and they don't know that next bit, then they're actually not going to be able to advise you on the next bit. You'll just essentially stay where you are. So when you look at these categories, it's really just a lens of thinking, what are all the aspects of advice, market access, credibility? What are all the intangibles I need to present to the market so that I can grow in the direction I want to grow? The next bit then becomes, okay, so we know we need a board. We understand the virtues of why. We now have an idea of the types of people we want. How do we actually get them? And the point I just made then was ask, like just don't be afraid of asking. I recommend asking first from, hey, reaching out to someone saying, hey, I'm doing this. I love what you did with XYZ. Would you mind just, if we jumped on a 30-minute chat, I'd love your advice, and be very specific. I'd love your advice on this. Don't just say, I want to pick your brain, because that's sort of like a time wasting, I'm going to poach your best ideas. But you're actually going specifically and say, hey, I'm trying to think of an example, but let's say it was someone who built an entrepreneur who built a significant business in a certain sector. You want them on your board. You say, hey, I really love what you did with that business. I'm now trying to build this in a similar domain. I'm struggling with this specific problem. Any chance we could catch up? And I'd just love your advice on it. And start building that relationship. Now, when they give you advice, it's important as well that you take that advice on, actually go and run the experiment, and then feed back to them, like give them the loop back of how that went. It's like, hey, you gave me this advice, just to let you know, I went away and did it. Here's what I found out. I really appreciate it. Would you mind catching up again so we can talk about this again? So that's one way to build a relationship with someone to bring onto your board. Another is just, if you are at the point where you've raised some funding and you actually have the ability to pay for board members, you can actually go to things, actually offer someone a contract to come onto your board. You could put them on your advisory board first. You can also, if you're really struggling, go through the Australian Institute of Company Directors and actually search their database for directors to come onto your board. You can get feedback from others about who's on their boards. Ask in the investor circles that you want to raise from one day. Start doing some research. So if you want to be invested in by Blackbird, who's typically on those boards that Blackbird invests in? Because that's a good signal. If that's your goal, that's a good signal of the type of person or the individual to put on your board. The other part of this is when you bring them in, you can vary the appointment. So what I mean by that is, because board members have to be voted by the shareholders, that means if you find, you've got for whatever reason, you want the CEO of Telstra on your board and they say yes. You still then need to bring them in to be voted in by shareholders as a member. So even though you've gone and got them, until the shareholders vote, they're not actually, you can't just appoint them as a director. Now, when the shareholders or members vote, you can then appoint them as a director. You might want to start them on a 3-month initial appointment. And what that means is after a 3-month term, they can then be re-voted in again by the shareholders. I recommend staggering the appointments. So don't have your whole board being able to be voted out on one day. Like, everyone's on a 12-month appointment, everyone comes up at the same time. The reason is if something happened to your shareholder base, it's a real risk of how the company could significantly change its management and essentially have a covert takeover, for example. I know that's an extreme example. But also you want continuity of knowledge, and you want to protect, like, part of the good governance practice is ensuring continuous knowledge base of the governance of the company. So varying the appointments is really important. One thing I recommend for you, if you're the founder or you guys are the co-founders and you're on your own board, make your own appointment, like a 3-year appointment, and make the new directors that come in maybe a 12-month appointment. So you have some surety of your directorship for an extended period of time. Whereas the new people coming in, it's sort of like you've got this ability to remove them if necessary. Like, you don't have to renew their appointment. The other thing is have an odd number of directors just for decision making. It makes it easier. Another way around that is you appoint a chair, so you can have a chairperson, and the chairperson then might have the final voting right. You can decide what matters need what quorum of votes in order to be passed. So some boards, you have to have 100% unanimous vote for something to pass, whereas others it's like a 51% majority. Some decisions might be one, some decisions might be the other. You can actually define that. There's some that's sort of stipulated by law, but the rest you can define. And the other one here is about how you pay. So in the early stages, or if you're running a not-for-profit or a social enterprise, your board members might volunteer their time for free. They might volunteer their time for free subject to review when you hit a certain revenue threshold or a certain investment threshold, at which time they might then get paid XYZ. So you might bring someone onto your board and say, hey, would you come on for volunteer? But once we raise 10 million, we'll then shift you to a paid appointment. You might have discussions about what that is, or you might leave that open for when you get to that point. Other than free though, you can also offer cost recovery. So what I mean by that is you can say, board members are not paid for their time, but reasonable pre-approved travel to attend a board meeting will be reimbursed. So for example, we'll reimburse taxis of up to $100 per meeting. It's up to you how far you take that. That's purely just you can negotiate that. There's no real set standard. The other model is to pay for their time. So for each board meeting that you attend, you'll be paid $150 or $15,000. Like, it depends obviously on the board that we're talking about and who the people are. And then the last model is more around a retainer. So they get essentially a salary or retainer for the year, just based on their contribution. Now, again, this all depends on the stage of the company, who the individual is, and your expectation about how often you meet, how often you contact them, and all that sort of stuff. So some boards will only come together for a board meeting, and in between there's almost zero communication. Other boards, you might have quite regular comms with your board members. Like, you might talk to them once a week because you want advice or something like that. And again, this comes down to you and the people you choose. But the important point there is to set those expectations. So it's best to have an appointment letter when a board member comes in. Just have a very simple letter with some terms of reference. And basically what that defines, the terms of reference defines what are the responsibilities of the board members? What are you looking for them to help you with? How long are they appointed for? How often will boards meet? When do they meet? What's the expectation of how many meetings do they have to attend? So for example, you might say it's a monthly board meeting and board members are expected to attend at least 10 of the 12 board meetings a year. You can also have stipulations in there whether these are, whether remote attendance is fine. You might also stipulate in the terms of reference, is it a rotating chairperson or is it one appointed chairperson? all of this can be defined however you like, but you put that into a document so that everyone has clear expectations coming in of, okay, I'm expecting this many hours of you. I'm expecting you to be on call or not on call, just so everyone's on the same page. It's really important you do that though. Even explaining to them the voting rights in the company. So, they might want to see the shareholders agreement, for example. They might want to understand your cap table. So who does own the company, who has equity in the business, who has voting rights, all those sort of things they might be interested in as well. And the other thing that they'll be really interested in is who else is on the board. So particularly for volunteer directors, one of their motivations coming into the board is because they want to meet other people like them. That it's actually a networking thing for them. And so, and it's also a bit of a credibility thing for their own career path. So some people don't like to work with others, like they might have previous industry experience, or you might be inviting different board members on who've invested in different companies that are competitors to each other, and therefore those individuals don't want to be on the same board together. So they will want to see who else is on the board. And again, this is where it comes back to that last slide talking about who to have on your board. If you have the right person on your board, like a key industry influencer, that will attract others who want to be on that board just by virtue of wanting to work with that person. So it's a really, going back to you, Athol, if you had the health minister or former health minister, there'd be certain people who perceive value in being on a board with them. Maybe that's because they're running a pharmaceutical company and they want to build a relationship there, whatever it is. So this is where you should be really smart about not just who is on your board, but the order in which you put people on your board can also help you get other people to be on your board. So you can be a bit strategic. The other part of this is, so the other part of governance is insurance. So a good governance practice is having insurance. And this doesn't just mean like public liability insurance or professional indemnity insurance. They're just pretty much standard. A lot of what you need in specific clauses there will be dictated obviously by what you do and who you do it for, supplier terms, client customer terms. Athol, I imagine if you did a deal with Queensland Health, in the contract, there would be very specific terms on the type of insurance policies you need and the coverage and all of that. I had contracts with Google and they had an entire page of just in the contract detailing the insurance policies I had to have for all different global jurisdictions and who that had to be from. It was really specific. But the reason I mention it here as well is you should have an insurance policy to cover your board of directors. So this can come under different names. Sometimes it's officers and management insurance. But in the early days, you can probably get away with this. But good directors or experienced directors will often only come onto a board, even if it's volunteer, if they know that there is insurance protecting them for being on that board. And that's because if something goes wrong, in the eyes of the law, it's the directors that they go after. So having an insurance policy to protect the directors is really important. So a good insurance broker can help you set all this up. The last insurance policy I had for officers and management or management officers insurance, which covered the board and the C-suite, was about $6,000 a year. So it wasn't cheap. But in that case, there was a lot of international travel and other things that weighed into it. But there are cheaper ones. I'm not saying you have to do it from day one. Like as an entrepreneur, I would delay this, but to get certain people on your board, you will have to have it. And it's just good to protect yourself as well, particularly if you're starting to do things like signing leases or engaging in high value contracts or high repercussion or high risk contracts. Having something to protect the board is really important. Next, how to run a board meeting. So one thing I'll say here is even if right now you are just the sole director of your company, you still need to have a board meeting. So this can sound so bizarre, but the reason is when you're the founder and you a couple of mates who've started a business, the role that you have as CEO or co-founder is a very different hat to the hat you wear when you're a director. And you want to get into the practice of thinking in those different hats, thinking different between the operational activity and the management activity. to the corporate governance and directorship activity. Part of that practice of having board meetings, even when there's just one of you, which I know sounds insane, I'll go through it. But part of that is when an investor does come in, they see that you've got good governance. So going back to what I said right at the start as one of the reasons why, if ever you go for investment, if ever you aim to be acquired, even down to your insurance. So if you're a high risk category, the insurers might even look at your governance practices before underwriting anything that you're doing. You're setting yourself up for success by getting these things right from day one. Also, if ever you did go to court, like if someone sued you, and what will come out in the court action is they'll do a discovery process where they get legal discovery, means they get all of your documents. And if you can show a really good track record of, even when you were a solo director, you were having a monthly board meeting where you put on your director's hat and you went through the lens of being a director and looking at the business, the court looks at that really positively. So again, it would reduce like potential damages you might pay. It'll show that you're a good corporate citizen, that you adhere to your duties and responsibilities. Now, the way to do a board meeting, number one, have an agenda. So actually have an agenda, put it out in advance. And my recommendation is to have a standard agenda and then have other business at the end. So your agenda is pretty much, that you start, you note who's in attendance, you ask for conflicts of interest, so anyone to disclose any arising conflicts of interest. Then the CEO does all their reports. So the CEO does their operational activity report. They might do an OH&S and risk report. They might do the financial report. They might do an emerging opportunities report. Then they might do their topics for discussion and deliberation at a board. So anything that's been presented for a decision. And then it might be all other business. And different directors can add things into the all other business section for discussion. Now, one thing, just a technical thing that I like to do is, as CEO, I would write the draft agenda for the board. I would send it to all the board members to approve so they could add anything in. So it's the board's agenda, not mine as CEO. So I will draft it on behalf of the board, invite board members to add their things. Otherwise, they approve it and then it becomes the agenda. The CEO creates board papers that get presented at the board. And one of the practices I adopted was to always aim to have those papers to my board at least 3 business days before the board meeting. So you don't want to send it 2 weeks before, because by the time you get a board meeting, it's outdated. But at least 3 business days before gives the board members the opportunity to read the papers. Now, I encourage you to have an expectation of your board that they read things before the meeting. So I don't like board meetings where you go in and basically just read the report. To me, that's a waste of time. The best use of a board meeting, and to respect everyone's time the most, is for everyone to read the board papers prior to the meeting, and then the meeting is a discussion of them. So it's a chance for the board members to go, hey, CEO, on page 13 where you talked about this in the finances, I don't get this bit. Or I'm worried about our cash flow forecast at month 7. Or I'm worried about this OH&S incident that you mentioned here. What's our procedure around that? You don't want if a director does come to a meeting and it's obvious that they haven't read the board papers, you should actually call that out. So you should actually say, look, there is an expectation, and this goes back to your terms of reference and letter of appointment. You expect the board members to be proactive in reading everything before the meeting. The other key part of a board, and one of the most critical bits of a board meeting, is minute keeping, so minute taking. Now, I've seen a lot of CEOs do this themselves. I don't recommend that. You as CEO in a board meeting, you want to be absolutely 100% present in the room in the conversation. So bring in someone else to take minutes. Now, there's a few ways you can do that. If you have a team member, you can bring them into the meeting. Just be conscious, though, of the types of things that are going to be discussed in the meeting that maybe that team member shouldn't hear. So I used to do this with Startup Catalyst. We were a team of 2. My ops manager would come into the board meetings. She would take all the minutes. But every now and again, we might have to ask her to leave the room. And it's not an ego thing. It's just purely from a perspective of making sure that we've created a psychological safe space to have the right conversation in the room. We can have the hard conversation. We can talk about employee incentives, or in that case, it was about her wages and her contract. You need to be able to have those board conversations with a different hat. But having someone there as a dedicated resource to take minutes is really important. Now, in the minutes itself, this is an interesting thing because the minutes are an artifact that can later appear in court cases. So if a company is sued for some sort of negligent behavior, the board might say, well, we discussed this, we put in policies and procedures. The court will actually ask for the minutes of that board meeting. So you want minutes that are detailed enough to show that you had good corporate governance, but not so detailed as to hang anyone on the board. And I know like this is something probably not spoken about often outside the confines of a boardroom, but you do need to be careful of what goes into the minutes. Think of it as a public document. How would we feel if this document was made public is a lens through which you should read the minutes. So just be careful of how you summarize things. And what I mean by that is one dot point could simply be general discussion of our insurance policies, agreement that no changes need to be made, subject to review in 6 months' time. That might cover a 30-minute conversation that you had in the board meeting. That might have sufficient detail. Sometimes a board member might ask for the minutes to reflect a specific point that they made, and that's essentially to protect their own butt. And I know that can sound a bit negative, but you should actually respect that because the board members are actually carrying a lot of personal risk by being on your board. Now, those minutes, they get drafted and they should be sent back to the board after the meeting, and then they need to be signed by the chairperson of that meeting. Like all the directors need to agree that's a fair and accurate representation of the meeting. Sometimes they'll come back and say, I'd like this added that we talked about XYZ. I'd like this wording changed. And then eventually that gets signed off. And that record actually has to be kept. Like keep a hard copy, keep a soft copy. It's part of your good governance is that record keeping piece. Just a few other things on boards, because this is the main part of our governance chat today. But one is often I see and I know I've got this lens of founders and CEOs, but for anyone reporting to a board, and I should say here that sometimes it's not just the CEO reporting to the board. So if you're a bigger company, you might get your CFO to come in and do the financial report piece. You might get someone to come in and if there's been an HR incident, you might get your HR manager in to come and talk about something. You might get all different people present to your board. But in all times, I'd encourage you to have the philosophy and the culture where no problems are hidden from the board. So this is where a nuance of the power play can play out, because ultimately for the CEO, it's the board that determines their salary, like their remuneration, their incentive schemes, their bonuses. And so often the CEO is therefore motivated to present this amazing picture. Everything's going really well. Look, everything's going up and to the right. And so they can hide the shit bits in the reports or not show them. I really do not encourage that at all. I always think of my boards as a good board will back the CEO. So a good board will absolutely back the CEO and trust the CEO. But that only works like if you have mutual trust and respect. And that only works if you have total honesty and transparency. And the way I think of my boards, when something's going wrong in the business, I go to my board and say, hey, we have this problem. What are we going to do about it? Because they're part of the company. And they are your biggest asset to help you solve problems. Now, another way that can manifest out in a power play is when your investors are on your board. So your investors who you've just gone and sold the vision of your company to, everything's amazing. They come in, they go on your board, and now you've got to go into a meeting and say, oh, it's all shit. We just lost our biggest client, whatever it is. Again, you have to be honest. An investor, at the slightest sniff of dishonesty, an investor will walk away, directors will walk away, you lose all credibility. But more importantly, they are your brightest brains who have the most strongest vested interest in making the business work. So use them as a resource. And part of that is that last point there of valuing debate and questions. So I'm actually more alarmed. I've had board meetings where we go in and, we get to the agenda. It's like, okay, you've got my CEO reports, any questions? And they're like, no, everything looks amazing. And it's like, any other business? It's like, no. Then it's like, no, this is not right. Like, I don't just want to be told it's all good. Like, what am I missing? What are my blind spots? Like, what should I be doing? How do we 10X this? Why are we not doing X, Y, Z? Like, I want my board to be asking me the tough questions. So for me, like, one of my favorite boards I ever had was Steve Baxter was chair. I had a high profile lawyer out of Brisbane and a high profile accountant. And they would just ask like Steve always asked the right questions. He would see through the numbers. He was really good at the numbers, see through the business, know exactly where we should be. And we'd known each other for a while. So it's just this good, safe space where we could have those discussions. And honestly, I really miss that board. And then I've been on other boards. I was on the board of Startup Oz, and it was just like this. I don't know how to describe it. Sort of like a love fest where everyone was too polite. And I ended up leaving that board because I thought it was ineffective. I was like, this is like, what's the point of being on this board if we're not actually dealing with real issues and we're just all doing pleasantries to one another? So really think of that. Like, sometimes board meetings can be quite hard and tough, and you've got to go deliver the bad news, but it's important you do that, and it's part of your job. And so the last 2 points here as well is you want to build rapport in that group. So if they don't already know each other, you really want to put in some effort to get mutual trust and respect amongst the board members so that you've got a psychological safe space at a board level where they can say anything to each other. And so the best way to do that, like we know, shared experiences, go for a drink, go do an activity together, have a dinner together. They want to connect, remember as well. So, have some social events. Does that all make sense about board meetings? Anything I missed? Any questions in there?
That was really good, actually. Because you can hear about all the other bits and pieces, but actually running one, all of it makes sense. One day I hope to get there.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You can start, even just with yourself, like documenting an agenda and even just creating the reports. Like I found as CEO having to produce, regular reports on the business at regular intervals was really good just for my own sense of governance of the company. So as a CEO, even when I'm not on the board, having to do the financial reports, having to do the CEO report, having to do the OH&S report, it forced me, like it was just a really good cadence of my finger on the pulse of, okay, what is operationally going on? What are the metrics? How are we tracking? Are we on target? And this is why I say, even if you're just a solo founder, that practice of writing the reports, even for yourself, other than being a good governance practice to identify potential fraud and other things, it's also just for your own awareness of the company and knowing the pulse of your own business is really important. So it's definitely something you could start, starting to do now and just build up that skill set.
Yeah, it's a good idea, eh? Yeah. Yep.
Just one other thing to mention here. So, this is typically for more established companies, but you can start forming subcommittees of your boards. So, for example, when we got acquired by the Australian Computer Society, I was part of the senior executive team there, often had to do reports to the board, and they had quite a big governance board. And they had lots of committees. So what a committee at a board level means is where multiple board members come together. So say in the case of ACS, I think the board was like 20 people. It was pretty insane. But then you might have a committee of 5 who might be focused on corporate sponsorship or ethics. So you might have an ethics committee. You might have an R&D committee. You might have an acquisitions committee where that might be a committee that's looking at what should we acquire. And I know for those of you listening who are startup founders, you might be thinking acquisitions are so far away, but they're actually not. Like I know a couple of the companies I've invested in that are sort of now at their Series A, Series B stage, they're actually already acquiring other startups. So having a committee that just looks at, what's in the market that we might want to acquire or partner with could be one of your committees, for example. And again, you might have a compliance committee. You might have an audit committee. You might review a specific policy and have a committee for that, for example. But it's just another way you can use your board, other than through board meetings, is to give them little committees with a very specific task to go and do. Record keeping. So we
Aaron,
talked. Yeah, sorry, mate.
With your board, so because I've got a question around like an executive director versus just a director, and so the board are active in getting involved in the nuts and bolts rather than being at an arm's length.
Yeah, sorry, it broke up a little bit there. Could you just say that again?
I was just wouldn't mind a clarification around, roles like executive directors versus just directors. And does your board get involved in the nuts and bolts, or are they meant to stay at arm's length, or how does that work with the committee sort of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So executive director is like very hands-on in the business. So often it's almost like they're an employee. And non-executive is quite independent. And there's a point where you want both. There's a point where you want them to be highly engaged in the business, and then there's a point where you want them to be independent. So I'll share a story of Michael Dempsey. So Mick founded Easy Debit, and Easy Debit was a payment processing thing that sits behind a lot of gyms and that sort of stuff, like subscription model credit card payments. And when I can't remember who started it with him, but anyway, founded it originally. But as it grew, he ended up where he was essentially a non-executive director, like quite disengaged. And he would just float in and sort of like check the pulse of the business. And I was talking to him about that one day, and he said that was really effective because that external view and coming in every now and again gave him a different perspective to if he was still living and breathing it. So like we know, like the boiling a frog analogy, like slowly boil a frog and it won't jump out because the water's just getting slowly warmer, as opposed to throwing it straight into boiling water. Or if you see yourself in the mirror every day versus you haven't seen yourself for like 5 years. So he described that was really effective. And what he would do is just one day a week, he'd sort of just walk the floors of the business and he would hear a totally different conversation. So where I'm going with that is, there is a point where that's really important, is someone who has that more like helicopter sort of perspective, like in and out, and they've got that external lens. That externality of perspective can be really powerful. So non-executive can play a huge role. But the hands on the tool stuff is really good for anything practical you need. So, like the Google founders, for example, and there's nothing wrong with being both, an executive, an employee, and a director. You just need to be very conscious of what hat you're wearing when. So, when you're being CEO, all right, this is my management hat, this is my execution hat, as opposed to, all right, I'm board member, this is governance, compliance, overall holistic vision of business financials and all the rest. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess the reason I brought it up is that a little while ago I was looking at bringing on someone to help me with a bit of that leadership in a director's role, and he specifically he wanted an executive director role, and it was just a little bit confusing of where it all laid and what the expectations were, I suppose. I haven't progressed along with it because it did become a bit confusing. How much does he expected to contribute?
Got it. Right. Yeah. So look, the fundamental answer to that is it's whatever you guys negotiate. So you can set that expectation in agreement with them. One thing I would say though, one thing I used to do bringing people onto boards was I would actually give them an information pack on what it means to be a director and what their legal obligations are. So McCulloch Robertson used to have this like 2-pager. It was just a PDF. I could download it off their website. They as a law firm had prepared this. And when bringing someone on the board, I'd have the terms of reference, which is what we had negotiated for their engagement, like all the specifics of how much time, when, do they get, cost recovery, payment, whatever, what their expectations are. But then I'd attach this 2-page PDF just on the basics of what it means to be a company director. And I would do that even if I knew someone was an experienced company director, because I want to make sure that they know what they're signing up for. So yeah, the short answer is it's ultimately up to what you negotiate. What I would say though is make sure it's transparent with the other board members. So what I mean by that is if you've got one board member, say they're an executive board member, very hands-on, they're giving you 10 hours a week, and then you've got a non-executive board member who gives you like 2 hours a month, it can cause friction if they're not aware of each other's commitment. Like it can look to one person as, well, you know, John's not lifting his weight, Mary's doing all of these hours, and they're both on the board. So making sure that everyone's across each other's expectations as well, like everyone has that understanding, is really important.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good advice. Tough.
I mentioned record keeping in the context of a few things so far, one around the minutes and all of that. But you should have really good record keeping of all your corporate stuff. So again, going back to the start, partly because if ever you want to be invested in or acquired, you'll need this documentation. Also, if you're ever the subject of a lawsuit or criminal action, criminal charges, you would need this documentation. But also, it just sets a really good positive culture in the organization. If you as the, something going on split spaces, but if you at the top have good record keeping practices. So what I typically do, I have a folder structure that I use for any business that I'm running. It's a folder structure, and in there I put in, you know, basic things like my ASIC registration, my company constitution, my shareholders agreement, my insurance policies, key contracts, employment agreements. I keep all the minutes of all the board meetings, any key supplier agreements. Basically anything that I sign as a company director gets put in there. And it's really important you have that practice of really good record keeping, not just dropping it in a random folder somewhere, but actually structuring it in a logical way is quite important so that it's easy to find. And just on that, personally, I separate. So we use Google Drive for most of our businesses. Everyone uses something different, but we structure it in a way where we have a corporate folder, which is anything that only board members and like the CEO should have access to. Then we have an operations folder, and that's for anything that, you know, the staff might need access to. And then we have a financials folder. And by having that hierarchy structure, we can then control who has access to what information. So not everyone on the team needs access to the corporate folder that has, for example, everyone's employment agreements that shows what everyone's earning. Or, you know, the nuances of our insurance policies or whatever else. And the financials, we only give access to like the people who are looking after the accounts, maybe the bookkeeping, the auditor, that sort of stuff. So even how you structure your record keeping is really important. The next thing to look at is delegations. So you may not have heard of this before. And when we look at most businesses, they're actually operating without any delegations. Now, what I mean by that is, in the eyes of the law, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I should caveat this is not legal advice, this is my interpretation and understanding. But the board essentially is, so directors are assigned responsibilities and authorities under Corporations Act. Now, for a staff member, including the CEO, to have an authority to make a payment, that responsibility has to be delegated from the board to the CEO. So what we call that is a delegation. And that's as simple as like a one-page, it's not even a page really, it's a couple of paragraphs that just says, the board authorizes Aaron Birkby as CEO to make any payments or incur any expenses on behalf of the company, subtotaling no more than, and then there might be a limit, right? And those limits could be really detailed or they could be quite broad. So it could say up to $50,000 and then that's it. It's as vague as that. For me, the way I personally like to do it when I'm a CEO is I actually put in my annual budget to the board. I say, okay, board, here's my budget for the year. Can you approve this now? And anything that's in that budget for the year, me as CEO, I can go and execute on that. I don't need their approval. The only thing I have to get approved is anything outside the budget that exceeds a certain dollar value. So I can't remember what that dollar value was, but it might have been like $5,000. So if it's outside the budget and it's not already in the approved budget and it exceeds $5,000, I have to go to the board for approval. Now, when you're first starting, set the delegations low. So maybe you do a 6-month budget. Maybe it's approval up to $100. Maybe there's a travel policy. So maybe you have a policy around travel where you as CEO, you're allowed to pay for taxis up to a certain threshold, whatever. The other part of this is when you sign up. So say you've got a financial delegation from your board. So this is a written letter from the board, signed by the board, saying, Athol, you as the CEO can spend money on these things in this way. You'll have a financial policy there with how the receipts have to be handled, all that sort of thing. Part of that then becomes like you then have an obligation to stick to that, right? Like as the CEO. So you have to abide by that policy. Now, where it can become a problem is, so for example, with Startup Catalyst, we'd be traveling overseas, a snowstorm would hit, and now I've got to move 20 people who are stuck in Denver, can't fly to San Francisco, put them into a new hotel. That's going to cost me like $15,000. It's not in my budget. I don't have approval to do it. I literally have to pick up the phone, wake Steve up at 3 a.m. and say, can you approve this transaction? You have to do that. You can't, even though I had a really good relationship there with Steve and I knew he would back me after the fact, you can't just, you can't break the rules, because the court would look at that and go, how did you act? Did you follow the procedures? Did you follow good corporate practice? Because ultimately you're responsible to the shareholders. So ultimately, all these rules and governance are set up so that you can be accountable to the shareholders of the company and that you can be accountable in the eyes of the law and to your customers and just good corporate social responsibility. So once you have all these things in place, you actually have to stick to them. Just sharing a personal thing. So Steve Baxter, he had a rule which was all of his, any entity he was involved in as an investor or a funder or on the board of would always get an annual audit. It was one of his criteria. So you would get it, the company would be completely audited. And as I said at the start, what we mean by audit isn't just like a financial or tax audit. It's an audit of process and procedure. So in every decision, did we follow the procedure? Did we follow the process? And his rule was, even if there was the slightest discrepancy, like a $1.50 discrepancy, that was immediate termination, because dishonesty had a zero tolerance policy. And so it's really important that I believe in those practices, like zero tolerance on dishonesty. Having good governance means having procedures, and there's going to be times where they don't work. And like there's going to be a snowstorm. You never predicted the bloody snowstorm. So then what you do is you come into the next board meeting and say, we need to revise the financial delegations. In the event of a significant incident during a mission in market, the CEO now has financial approval for emergency funding of $15,000 once off, but subject to notifying the board as soon as practically possible, and subject to missions now having that factored into their pricing or something like that. I think that was the discussion we had at a board level. Anyway, the key point here is you need a financial delegation from the board. Now, even if you are, again, just a solo founder, I recommend doing this because, again, if ever you were dragged into courts, you can point to the fact that you're a good corporate citizen, you behaved with good governance. Look, Mr. and Mrs. Judge, I have all my delegations in place. I stuck to everything. It's a really good point of evidence as opposed to someone making the accusation and you've got no evidence. So have a financial delegation. What are you authorized to spend money on? Up to what level? How do you spend that money? Is it on a credit card? How do you account for it? All that sort of stuff. You also need delegations to hire and fire people. So for example, some companies authorize the CEO to hire staff up to a salary of $100,000 a year, but anyone being hired over that salary has to go to the board for approval. Also, who has the delegation to fire people? Can the HR manager fire someone? Is it only the CEO? Does the firing of an executive team member have to come from the board? So these are all things that you need written. You need to protect yourself and others. You need all this written down. Who can open accounts? Who can sign legal documents? Who can sign a lease agreement? Who can sign a supplier agreement? So if you technically under the law, if you don't have, if you're just, certain employees that sign things or sign up to subscriptions are often doing it without the legal authority to do it. So it's really important you have all of this documented. I know it seems like a huge overhead, but literally you could just start with one page in Word that covers these things just in the most basic language. It doesn't need to be legal terminology to start with. But that said, a good lawyer can also set this up for you. And the other thing is you've got Dr. Google, where you can just go ask Google, and there are that many templates out there. Different companies have posted theirs publicly. Universities are a great resource. They often have all of these sort of policies and delegations publicly shared. So you can go and take a template, steal a couple of paragraphs. You could have something done in like half an hour. Just a great way to protect yourself. Which then leads into policies and procedures. And I'm not going to dwell on this one because I've talked about it in a different workshop. But as your team grows, it's really important you have policies and procedures. Again, it's just a good governance practice. Like going back to where we started this conversation today, governance being about the control and direction of a company. Policies and procedures are what creates control. It creates a framework in which staff can operate in the absence of being observed. So policies and procedures are what keep people safe. It's the reason pilots have checklists. It's the reason factory plants have safety checklists. Policies and procedures are just as important in those high-risk environments as they are if you're building a software company or anything else. So make sure you've got policies and procedures, especially around simple things like password management, IT security, use of devices. So are staff authorized to take devices home? Can they connect your work laptop to a public Wi-Fi at an airport when they're working on your source code, for example? Because if you're working on source code, like in your space, Athel, like healthcare, and imagine you end up integrating with the HR system, right? Then that does play out for you one day. And one of your developers is on a plane and they're just like going on holidays, but they're taking the work laptop and they're going to code and they connect at an airport and they get a middleman attack with someone's put up a Wi-Fi hotspot as a middleman attack. They steal all your code base. Next thing you know, you're on the front page of the Courier Mail because some hacker has gone through your code to access the HR system at Queensland Health and brought down the health system and blah, 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 caused the next payroll crisis. So this is where policies and procedures are really important. And I know that's an IT hacking example, but this can manifest in all different ways. So make sure you've got policies and procedures in place. And part of that documentation piece, I did mention this before, but again, good governance is having your basic legal documents together, including your shareholder agreement. And again, even if you are the only shareholder of the company, having a shareholder agreement defines how you interact with the company. So and again, this is talking about one sort of class of corporate entity type. So I get that there's partnerships. I get that there's, depending on how you structure a not-for-profit or a charity or a sole trader or a business name, or depending on what jurisdiction you're in. But if we're talking about, the entity type predominantly used in Australia by most businesses, Pty Ltd or proprietary limited, having a shareholder agreement is really important. So having a constitution, and again, these are standard templates. They come with your ASIC registration, for example, in the case of constitution. Any good startup lawyer can provide these. There's a heap of templates available as well. So if you, again, go to Google, search for startup legal templates, the ones I recommend, so StartMate open sourced their documents. AVCAL, which is the Australian Institute, the Australian Venture Capital, sort of like governance body, they released a heap of templates. Allen's law firm released a heap of templates. You can use pretty much any of them. The important thing is to have something. If you need a good lawyer for this stuff, I really recommend a guy called Will McCulloch, based out of Sydney. He was part of McCulloch Robertson. He's not a named partner at McCulloch, just happened to have the same surname. But he focuses predominantly on startups and scale-ups. And he's worked on both sides, well, three sides of the table, both startup side, investment, like for investors, and for companies who are acquiring startups. So he has that domain knowledge. I recommend him because he's when I was running Catalyst, he came on 3 missions to the UK startup scene and really understands, going global. I've referred hundreds of clients to him, never heard a bad thing. He's really highly regarded, but there's lots of others too. So the point is, there's no reason not to have these agreements in place when they're publicly available, when there's good lawyers to help you. Now, this odd looking screen here is something we call a data room, which again is in this vein of like file keeping. So when you go through an investment or acquisition process, you'll have a data room, or it's also known as a deal room, like a slightly different nuance. But anyway, the point of this is where you store all the documents and data. And when you're getting investment during the due diligence process, this is what you give access to the investors, typically after they've given you a term sheet. So they've looked at your business, they like what you're doing, they've tentatively made you an offer, typically in a term sheet. So you know the terms of the deal. Now it's all conditional on them actually lifting the hood on your startup or on your business and making sure that everything you said is true and that there's nothing there that's an alarm bell. So lifting the hood is when you give them access to your deal room. Now, this goes back to what I was saying before about you want all this set up from day one, where you've got good folder structure of all of your corporate documents. So your ASIC registration, business name registration, trademark registration, paperwork, patent registrations, all of those agreements we just talked about, your board history, your insurance policies, your financial statements for every year broken down by quarter. You've got IP deeds of assignment. So if you've gone on Freelancer and someone's designed your logo, or you've gone to 99 Designs, or you've used the design agency, or some kid in the family that's your sister's twin cousin 13 times removed, whatever it is, you need a piece of paper that says they gave you ownership of that IP. And it's amazing how many times an investment deal falls over because the company thinks they own all this IP, but they've got nothing to prove that they own it because they paid a developer who never actually assigned over the IP. So you need IP assignment letters, deeds of assignment, whatever you've got, and it all needs to be in a folder structure so that when you hit this point, someone comes, knocks on your door and says, Athel, I want to buy out your company. Here's a $10 million check. You want to just be able to say, okay, here's under the hood. Now, by that point, you would have got them to sign a confidentiality agreement. We've talked a lot about confidentiality agreements before and why we don't use them in a lot of scenarios. But before you go and reveal all of this sort of stuff, you would absolutely want to be really far down the track. There's an offer on the table. You've signed a confidentiality agreement because this is where they're essentially lifting the hood on your IP and other stuff. So you don't want to reveal all of this before getting people down the road. But the point of this is, from a governance perspective, having all of this set up from day one makes it so much easier than trying to find it later, finding out you don't have it. Like just from your own governance, it puts you in a really good place of knowing you've got all these things ticked off. And again, if someone slipped in your driveway of your premises and took you to court, and during the legal discovery process, you have to hand over all your documents, knowing it's all just there, you put it on a zip drive and it's done, will save you hours of time and also present you in much better light in the court in terms of your case strength. There's a couple more to go. The next one is security systems and surveillance. So this is often missed when I've heard other people talk about corporate governance and good corporate compliance. They forget to make this point that just having systems for making sure that, because again, remember we talked about governance being also behaviors. How do you ensure good behaviors? Now, this isn't just behaviors of us as a board member or us as an executive or us as our team, but also, like we said at the start with those examples of why this matters, it's looking at the behaviors of our customers, our vendors and suppliers, our service professionals. So how do we have systems to detect fraud, to detect theft, to detect counterfeit products, to detect like competitive sabotage, to detect like if you're doing manufacturing, like quality control around your manufacturing, all that sort of stuff. All of that falls into this category really of good governance and good compliance. Now, if you take this to the extreme, well-established companies will often have internal affairs teams. So some of the previous work I did in intelligence roles, like it was really clear then, like you're openly told that, there's internal affairs, that they watch everything you do, everything's audited, and you're given that knowledge coming in. So it's all fully disclosed. And by disclosing it, it sets that expectation of your behavior. Most startups don't go to those lengths, and this isn't about surveilling our staff members, because you have to build mutual trust and respect. But having having log systems that can log, who's accessed what, when did they access it, and being able to provide that to an independent auditor to review on, well, why did they access that, for what purpose? You can start. You've basically got systems to identify potential fraud. That's the goal here. Again, depending on the sector you're working in. So if you're doing something in fintech, this is really important. Having systems to detect, even things like counterintelligence. So one of my businesses, we had software that ran, it was back-end internet billing for hotels and shopping centers and mining camps and internet cafes. We were like the payment processing that sat behind that. And our software managed a lot of public internet terminals. Now, for those of you who watched like any sort of spy movie, you know that spies always go to an internet cafe to use an anonymous internet terminal. So about once every 2 to 3 months, we would have the AFP contact us, requesting information from our logs of our software, because they'd been used either for, some sort of sexual offender or predator, or because of some national security issue. And so that's something we never anticipated as a software company providing this, that we would have to have systems to track that. But then multiply that by fintech. If you're in fintech, one of the highest areas of regulation is around, preventing international money laundering, money laundering from the criminal market into the real market. So, and just sabotage, and particularly even international espionage. So you suddenly have to have systems to capture all of that, and systems to do auditing on. So again, contextual. Some of you may not have this in your realm of having to worry about too much, but it is something to be on your radar to think about. Then one of the other things that's often forgotten when we talk about good governance is just having a good corporate culture. So we've done a whole session before on company culture, but if you remember the way I defined it, it's looking at culture. When you have a defined organizational culture, it defines how people should be behaving when they're not being supervised. It basically gives everyone a behavioral decision-making framework. So you can have a cultural statement actually written on your wall. I've used the example of a friend of mine who has sort of like a new approach to veterinary care, and they've built an animal welfare hospital, like holistic Western medicine meets Eastern medicine hospital for animals. And their cultural statement is, any staff member makes a decision on this basis. Is it right for the patient, in other words, the pet? Is it right for the customer, in other words, the pet owner? And is it right for the business? And if it meets those 3 criteria, that staff member, doesn't matter if they're the cleaner or the vet or the CFO, has the authority to make that decision, and they'll be 100% backed by management. But the other part of their culture is mutual trust and respect. So they've created a psychological safe space where people can call out each other's behaviors. And that takes a lot to put into effect. But you want to have a safe space where if someone does notice something that's not right, a behavior that's not right, it gets called out. And part of that is you as the boss, both if you're on a board or if you're a CEO or executive, you have to call out and act on bad behavior that doesn't align with the culture. Because the standard you walk past, the standard that you tolerate, will propagate as the standard that everyone adopts. So you need to be exceptionally fast at calling out and correcting bad behavior. And if you do that, then the rest will tend to fall into place. And I've given this example before. Mayor Giuliani, when he was the mayor of New York, back when people liked him before he became Trump's lawyer, he had this analogy, which was they were looking at the city and rejuvenating the city, and there were warehouses, abandoned warehouses all around the city at the time. And what they noticed was if a warehouse window was broken, then if they repaired that window within 24 hours, that building would remain unvandalized. But if they let that window, the broken window, remain for more than 24 hours, then kids would come along and throw rocks at the other windows and break more. And then with more broken windows, it would just look like dilapidated. So then people would go and graffiti the building. And before you knew it, had homeless people living in the building. And so it became the broken window syndrome. But the analogy was you have to correct the fault or bad behavior immediately to prevent it instigating or catalyzing more negative behavior. So think about your culture that way. You've got to optimize for the culture of behavior that you want. You need it to be defined and written. And there's lots of examples you can go on Google of different companies, their cultural statements. But you've got to live it as the leader. Like you can't just have a culture statement on the wall and then your behaviors be something different. They can't just be words, they've got to be a behavior. And this is all in the context of governance. This is governance of behavior by having a defined culture that everyone adopts and adheres to. But it's also about creating a psychological safe space in which people can air things that are going wrong. So if they suspect something or they're suspicious of something or they just think something isn't right, they should be able to tell the boss. And that should be rewarded and the common practice. So to clarify that in terms of how these things manifest, if you look on the left, we talk about psychological danger. So this is when team members are afraid of admitting mistakes. So what do? They hide their mistakes. That's not good corporate governance. When your team can't share that they fucked up and they're like, they try and put it under the rug, or it leads to more hiding, more lies, more dishonesty. They'll blame others. They're less likely to share opinions, which means then you develop silos where there's fractional communities within your organization. There's fractional information sharing. Therefore, people aren't making the best decisions. Therefore, it leads to mistakes or to poor quality control, but also leads to a team that's just dysfunctional and doesn't want to work together. So your goal is to be over on the right-hand side where people are comfortable admitting their mistakes. They share their mistakes because they're working as a tribe with others, and they know that if they share the mistake, then it helps everyone. It helps the greater good. They learn from that failure. They share new ideas. They're respected. They're heard. They feel validated. They feel understood. They feel respected. So it's really important. You have to spend so much of your time as a CEO and even as a board member engineering this sort of environment. And it's something you do from day one. So even when you bring in an intern, even when you're working with a supplier, even when you're working with your investor, you need to be nurturing this type of relationship. And again, part of this, the cultural piece and having that psychological safety piece, part of achieving that is by having 360-degree performance reviews and appraisal reviews. Now, if you haven't heard of this concept before, go Google it. There's a ton of content. Go on YouTube. But basically, if you look at the way most organizations do performance reviews, it's one-to-one. It's boss to subordinate. And the problem is it's such a narrow lens through which to view performance. And we've all seen people get promoted, and it's like, how did that person get promoted? They're terrible. But the way they present to their boss is very different to the way they behave everywhere else. So the goal of a 360-degree feedback process is where everyone gets feedback from everyone. So you get feedback from your boss, and you get feedback from your customers, you get feedback from your peers, you get feedback like from yourself, people that work for you, people in different teams. You get a holistic view of how you are showing up and operating. And you want to do this for everyone in the team and even your board members. So think about having a performance review for your board members and putting that in your terms of reference as an expectation early. Like actually give them feedback. Hey, I'm the CEO. And this is something that Alex McCauley, who's the CEO of Startup Oz, he did this really often with me when I was on the board of Startup Oz, and I really appreciate it. Outside of the board meetings, he would ring me up and he'd say, hey, how are you going? He asked me, what do I need as a board member? How could he be a better CEO for me? But then he also flipped it and said, here's what I need from you as on my board. Like, here's what I'm not getting from you right now. Here's what I'd like to hear. And that's super powerful. And it just demonstrates there's a lot of trust there. There's a lot of respect there. So think about this concept of 360-degree feedback reviews. These can be formal or informal. They can be systematized, or they can be, face-to-face conversation, but super powerful to create the right culture of good governance. And then I'm pretty sure this is my last one on the list, and that is the audit. And I know I've already talked about it, so I don't really need to dwell on it anymore. But again, this isn't something, if you're a small venture, you don't need to have this audit process, but appointing an independent external reviewer or auditor to come in and do a forensic analysis of how you're operating. And this can be an audit of your accounts. As I said before, though, this could be an audit of, are you following procedures, guidelines, checklists, even down to, are you storing all of your files and notes? Are you doing record keeping? Are you keeping logs? It's a really important thing to actually have. It becomes more relevant as you go down the path. So as you get more investors, as you get more key contracts that, you know, high risk, as you're collecting, like one area of audit is around, for example, the privacy information. So data that you keep on customers, like auditing that. Do we need to store this data? Do we actually need to collect this data? Could we actually delete this data now if it serves no more purpose? How do we protect our customers? Do we have the right systems in place to protect against hacking? Often there's data breaches of companies that the data breach has been there for 2 years. Like there's been a hacker or a competitor siphoning off information out of a system for 2 years before it gets picked up in an audit process. And without that audit process, it would never have been detected. So even if it's not an independent external auditor, what you could do in the early stages or in a small team is have someone from a different team in the same company come and look at what you do and say, hey, just through your lens, do a little audit on us. Are we doing things right? Could we do things better? I think it's a really healthy process to go through. And that's it. So I know that I'm saying that's it. There's been a lot there, but that's like pretty much 2 hours on governance.